Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is Retired Orphan, and today we're going to be doing something we haven't done in a very long time, so long that I have switched to DAWs. So today, this is, at long last, the sequel to How to Make Midtempo. The last time I broke down my song Error, and while I do think that video still has a lot of good resources, I felt that it was time to do an update considering how much has changed with what I do. So yeah, today we're going to be breaking down my song Riot, which just came out recently. If you want to hear that, you can hear it right here. If you're interested in hearing more from the song, you can go stream it in the link below. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much. And while you're at it, I put a lot of effort into these sort of videos, and I plan on doing more. So if you want to subscribe for literally free knowledge, hit the subscribe button. It's super easy. Ring the bell if you're into that, but most people don't do that, let's be honest. Anyways, let's get into the song. So we're going to be going over a lot of things. We're going to be going over sound design, and we'll be going over how to design most of the basses in the song. Unfortunately, one of them is completely rendered out, so because of the nature of the bass, and we'll get to it. So I won't be able to go into how it was made in like a super specific way, but I can at least go into how, like, what I did after making it. But we'll be going over in depth the rest of the basses in the songs. Groove, we went over that in the last one, but this is a completely different groove from Error. So I think it's a great song to go into, and it's also a bit different from usual Midtempo. It's not the usual 4 on the floor stuff, because let's be honest, you could just do 4 on the floor jumps and apply the concepts from this video and be just fine. Atmosphere, melodies, intros, breakdowns, orchestration, a bunch of other miscellaneous tips. So yeah, why don't we get into it? So we're going to start off at the beginning, the intro. There's a couple layers here. We have this pad layer. This one's pretty simple. It's just this pad preset from Labs. I thought it sounded cool, very synthwavy. Ignore this frequency shifter and this thing that's this build-up machine. We'll get into that once we get into the build-up of the song. So we have an OTT, just a standard OTT. I kind of switch off between Ableton's default OTT and this OTT because they're slightly different in how they handle what they do. They're very similar, but they do some things that are a bit different. So it kind of depends on which one I want to use. But in this case, I liked that one. Doing just a bit of EQ here. So I'm getting rid of the side signal in the low end because I don't want the sound to be super crazy in the stereo. And we're also cutting off everything off 60 hertz because while I do want the song to have, or not the song, the sound to have low end, I don't want it to be too crazy. So I kind of cut it off here. And then right here, I want to bring in that little sound, like that little peak right there. I wanted to accentuate that. And I'm also doing a small high shelf just in general. Then we have an ARP. So this next sound is an ARP. It's the main ARP you hear in the song. This is just the Nordpol 3 DP pluck preset, and I believe it's in Factory 3. So if you want to use that, it's literally just a sound. All I did was turn off the reverb and I think turn down the dry wet on the delay a little bit. I might not have even done that. So it's just an ARP, and we're using the delay inside. OTT to kind of compress it down. And then I'm using this transient shaper to kind of control the transits of the sound, because without it, it was getting really like aggressive and I didn't really like that. It was really plucky. And then I'm using this reverb because I wanted like a vintage reverb. And what do you know? This is probably one of my favorite reverbs. It's just really good all the time. It has an amazing sound. You can go through a bunch of different eras and they all sound very distinct and very cool. Doing a bit of normal compression. Just kind of keep the sound controlled. So this is going to be something that we're going to be getting into a lot in this video, and that's parallel compression. Parallel compression is essentially where you have your dry signal, and then you have your hyper compressed signal, and you are blending them together, and it like makes the sound feel bigger, louder, more prominent, and it's a really cool effect. It's also known as New York style parallel compression. Now, normally I would do this with a normal compressor. You absolutely do not need a parallel compression plugin. The only reason I use this plugin is because I got it for free at the time. I believe it's like normally like $50 to $75, which I do not consider worth it. I think this plugin creates great sounds, but you can absolutely recreate this with a normal compressor. Just like compress the signal a lot, turn the mix knob to 50. That's like your average parallel compression, and then tweak it to what would fit so you can blend more of the dry signal. So like in this case, this would be this like going down, or you can make it more of the compressed signal, so the mixed signal going up. But yeah, if you do have this plugin and you're curious on how it works, this is your parallel compression signal. So this is how much of the signal you are sending. Spank is how much you are compressing it and how quick it is, and output is how loud it is, and you can solo your hyper compressed signal. And then just some EQ things. Also, I should note that my mastering is on in this project. Things are probably going to sound louder while they're soloed, so keep that in mind. It's mastering the thing that I'm soloing. So when something suddenly seems very loud, that is why. That's going to be especially important once we get into drums. And then finally, I believe there's some like stereo. Yeah, just kind of keeping it in check. The sound has a lot of delay, so I don't want to minimize it too much. But generally, I want to keep it in the 0 to +1 area. Because if it gets too much over here, it's going to start phasing a lot, and we don't really want that. And then the organ. It's just an Expand 2 organ, nothing super special, with Valhalla Shimmer on it. This is specifically tweaked, so I turned on the mix a bit. No feedback, diffusion changed a bit, size changed a bit, and then changed the depth a bit, and then turned it to big stereo mode rather than mono. So this is all build-up stuff, and then kind of just low passing it a little bit. And then we have some choirs. So we have this one. This is just the Requiem Light library. Very good library. Highly recommend it. And then I'm using Pro R to create. I really like Pro R for realistic sounding reverb. I think it's a great sound for that. Pro C for some compression. So you might be hearing with that compression that it makes the voice really shaky. And normally I would not do that. But in this case, I wanted to use the compression with that sort of shakiness to make it feel like there's vibrato without the voice changing in pitch. It's a very neat trick. It's very situational. I doubt it would work on like a main vocal. It's probably only going to work for like a choir like this. But yeah, that's something that I used to just kind of simulate vibrato without making the pitch feel like it's going up and down a bunch. Because I'm not a huge fan of like over aggressive vibrato because of that. It's a neat little compression trick there. We've got this EQ. Just kind of making it a little bit brighter because it was kind of dark. And then we got this. Same library except it's on the E. valve sound, and it's also on the valve sustains. Got that same EQ, same compression technique, except I believe it is a little bit lighter this time. It is. And then just some EQ, kind of taming it down a little bit. And then we got some Foley. So this is just Valhalla Room. This is just a traffic sample. This is the default portal patch. It just sounded cool. Like it just sounded cool, gave it some nice rhythm, and then I'm just kind of band passing it with a low pass and a high pass. And then some more things that come in when this part gets introduced are these trumpets. Which is the Brass Ensemble Symphony series from Native Instruments. Highly recommend it. Super good. And then same for the trombone library. Oh. So let's go over each of these because processing brass is a little bit special. So we got a small reverb here just to give it that space. And then the Saturn is really what's key here. So we've got some distortion in the middle here, gentle saturation, kind of distort everything up here. Doing the fundamental tone of the trumpets here with some warm tape, and then gentle saturation on the tops as well. And then just kind of balancing it out because while without this, like it sounds okay, but the low end's super weak and it feels kind of tinny. And this just kind of balances out, makes it really fat, and it brings out the grit as well. It makes it feel a lot dirtier, which is pretty ideal for brass. And then we've got this just to kind of tame down some of these tones here and bring up the high end a bit because we still want that grit factor. And then controlling the stereo and keeping it in this positive range because a lot of orchestral sounds are extremely wide and you have to control them because otherwise they will take over your whole mix. And then similar case for the trombones here. I believe I copied this over. Actually, no, it is slightly different. This is more distorted and they're leveled a bit differently. I brought this up more. So it's similar, but it is different. Same reverb. And then different EQ here, keeping those low ends down. Side EQ to kind of keep the stereo in control. Same ozone to keep it in that positive range. I'm not a phase nut, but it is important that your sounds aren't phasing out too much like that. Like this ARP, for example, will occasionally go in that negative range. And it's fine. It's mainly when it's like overtaking sounds or phasing out of itself that you're like, okay, let's bring this back a little bit. All right, and then got some neat stuff here. So basically, this is a break that I separated. I think this was just for workflow to make making the rhythm easier because I definitely could have made this just one track. Basically, what I did was I took this break. So let me turn everything off here. And I decided, you know what, that sounds really weird. I don't really like it. So let's kind of first reverb it. And then do some downsampling after the reverb. So the reverb also sounds kind of low quality. And then this is a neat little trick you can do if you want to lo-fi some stuff. So if you have Reactor effects, I believe you can do this with the free version of Reactor as well. If an effects version is included, I'm not entirely sure. You can take it into like the build mode or whatever and just connect these two things right here into the outs through Reactor effects. And then you go to the quality here and you can put it to whichever one you want rather than these like fixed ones up here. And that allows you to kind of create these like pseudo lo-fi effects. Because like if I disable this, It's a lot more high end and it sounds very fake lo-fi. This kind of adds that final layer and it also tames down those like bit crushed peaks. And then we've got this compression just to keep it in check. Some EQ. And then just a limiter. Kind of down here. Keep it in check. But yeah, very cool thing that you can do. It's a very subtle layer, like you don't really hear it. It's something very faintly in the background, because watch what happens when I turn this off. It's something you only notice when it's gone. It's something that progresses the rhythm and makes it a bit more interesting, very subtly, but you're really focusing on these. So yeah, this is Damage. Nothing really much to explain here. I don't think I did anything special. I think I turned on maybe the compression. I don't remember. I usually just throw this on, turn the velocity way up on my hits, and then do a bit of reverb to get some high end because I feel like they're a bit dark naturally. Get some compression. And then just do a bit of EQ. And there we go. Kind of tame the low end a bit and then limit it. Something you're going to find is I use Contact a lot. I love Contact. And then we got this Orchestral Rumble, just a sample that I have. I put the same reverb on here. Similar compression. And then a bit of EQ. Except now I'm cutting it so that way when the hit happens, this isn't contesting with it. It just kind of creates that little rumble effect for the first hit. There is this. So unfortunately, this was a reactor patch that was absolutely murdering my CPU. I had to render it out, but I can tell you exactly like how this sort of patch is made. It's not going to one-to-one sound like this. But basically what you do is you take a low end saw wave, put a little low pass on it and have that kind of modulate like up and down, as you can see here. Make sure the saw wave has unison, really distort it, and then put a big reverb on it, and it'll sound pretty similar to that. Yeah, it's a pretty cool sound, and one that I really like to use a lot. And then we get into the build-up. So it's kind of funny that I'm covering this song, because this song has a somewhat similar build-up to Error, in the sense that it takes something out of Error's playbook. And that is this. Yeah, I'm just sort of building up here. And then at that end, kind of give it that final pitch modulation. So what I'm doing is I'm obviously chopping it and repeating it over and over again, doing that frequency shift at the end. And then I'm bringing up the mix. The low pass is coming up here and then chops off here so that way there's no more audio. And then we have a high pass that slowly comes up here. Normally I would probably drag this to here because sometimes having the high pass cut off like that can create a weird click, and I don't really like that. And that sort of similar concept is applied to all these synths here. Like I'll just go over this one for example, because it's all the same here for every other instrument that was in the intro. Basically, it gets shifted in the last 4 bars of the buildup. But in the first 4 bars, we got the mix that comes up in the last 4 bars as well, but the slow pass brings it up and then cuts off here as well. And then we've got a high pass that comes up. Kind of makes it feel like it's rising in intensity. This is basically just a typical like build-up reverb effect. You can find these all over the place, or you can just do this. The only reason, by the way, that this isn't in here is because for some odd reason, the default like middle value of this knob equals like 10 hertz up for this. So everything just sounds weird. So I have to make the frequency shifter separate, which is really annoying. I wish it didn't function that way, but it does. But yeah, every sound is like that. We've got a bass build up here, doing the sub rhythm in the drop. So I made this as I put a little LFO acting as an envelope on this filter here. That, a little bit of resonance, kind of give an acidy feel with some drive. Hyperdimension, phaser, chorus. This chorus is kind of emulating a flanger feel because of the lower delay times and the lower depth. And I also have it at a high pass, so everything above 200 hertz-ish is getting that effect. Multiband compression and hard clip distortion. Then we're going into some OTT. Fab Filter Saturn, just some warm tape with a bit of EQ here. Got ROM, which is just one of my favorite reverbs. Just has a great sound for like synths and basses. Got the EQ here. Now, I don't pitch shift up or frequency shift up the bass here because I want people to keep in that rhythm, but to give kind of the feel like you're doing it, I am high passing it as it gets farther up. Like when you listen to it by its own, it doesn't really sound like it, but when the whole build-up's there, that's kind of what it feels like. So let's talk the build-up drums and the fill. So there's a couple more build-up drums besides just that break. Yeah, just some build-up drums here, just standard build-up sample with a low pass and a high pass on it. And then I put the kick here. And then also similar concept to Error, because I was doing this like super fast break core, amen break build-up, we've got to kind of change the groove up. So we've got this counting of 4. And then we've got this kind of giving you like that hip hop-ish feel. And then some toms right here to get us into the song. It's just a pre-drop fill. So for the effects, nothing special. Got a reverse, which also just shows up throughout the drop the entire time. I probably should have taken it off the beat warp mode because it kind of has a weird feel to it, but it sounded fine in the grand scheme of the song, so I didn't change it, but normally I do that now. You've got an impact here. Just did some bass EQ, gave it more low end, tamed the high end a bit. Probably could have just done like the tilt EQ on here, but I don't know, I just kind of did it. I almost never use the tilt EQ. And then we got some risers. So this is in a massive, as you can hear. How I make my risers in massive is very interesting. And I'm going to, basically what I do, I go into massive. First of all, put the self up here. Basically what I'm doing is I am setting up to make massive create a riser for me. Basically creating a unique riser every time. And then we're going to go to oscillator and pitch it up. So that way when I do the pitch bend, go up 24. And then I'm going to put LFO 5 on to the first oscillator, LFO 6 onto the first filter, and LFO 7 onto the 7th filter. And then I'm going to press all of these and hit randomize. Now if I press M, that's like riser material, just straight up. It's just a unique riser every time. And then if I want to do pitch bends, I just go over to here. I go to MIDI control pitch bend. And boom. As this part of the MIDI goes, it'll pitch bend up. As you can see in this one, goes right here. I actually accidentally put it one like part forward when I shouldn't have, but it doesn't really matter. This part's like super low passed anyways. But yeah, neat little trick to create unique risers 100% of the time. Use this all the time for my risers. I no longer like try and create a unique one myself. I've been doing this for like 2 or 3 years. It's super useful. Shout out to the Whittler for teaching me this. But yeah, I do the same build-up machine stuff. And this one I don't do any frequency shifting due to already doing the pitch bending. Yeah, we got some reverb. did a bit of bit crushing on this first one. As it goes up, the bit crush pitch is also going up. And then I am band passing it. Just kind of give that feel, and then just a different one entirely. Same EQ. Yeah, super neat feel to that. And then now we get into the drop. So there's a couple things to talk about here. First of all, this beat, there's a lot to it. Let me loop this part because this has everything in it. I know things sound a bit aggressive here, but that's because I have my mastering on. If I were to turn my mastering off, so go from here to here and turn it off. That's how I mix the drums. I always mix my drums before I master them because I don't want my mastering to like influence what I would have done. That's the one thing I do before I slap my master on. I usually will do drums and like start a bit of a bass idea when I'm working on the drop. But yeah, this is disabled because I'm going to talk about this and the verses between these two when we get to mastering. But yeah, so kick drum. And for reference, if you missed it, I turned my mastering back on. There's a lot of kicks here. Some of them are a bit shorter, but it's still a lot. When thinking of a groove like this, it's very hip-hoppy, but normally hip-hop also doesn't have this many kicks. But when I was adding those kicks in, they were kind of meant to be like accent kicks. Even though they're still really strong, they're just slightly weaker and shorter. And it gave like a really cool, like rhythmic feel to the song that I loved. It gave a lot of flavor to the side chain. And yeah, it was just cool to do something that's not just kick, snare on 2 and 4. However, you will notice that there is one constant throughout all this. When it comes to at least the kick and the snare is always on 2 and 4. While the kick's doing all that crazy stuff, I felt like, at least for the first drop, I should keep it to this. But yeah, just kind of to keep the groove regular and like hi-hat simple and all that. The kick is the really main complicated part. I didn't want to get too busy with the drums. But yeah, let's get into this. So for the kick, I've got this multi-transient. I got this on sale for like $40. It's a really cool multi-band transient shaper. Just good for shaping up all these sounds. Kilohertz distortion. Just to kind of keep it in check. Titanium 3. It adds a lot of low-end power to the kick, because without it, the kick's fine, but it's missing that final, like, This is what will make your kick sound amazing on a system. I'm just going to keep it straight up. This little low end boost and being able to like attenuate it is perfect. Every kick I like did before I had this would sound okay on a system, but when I started using this plugin, my kicks sounded so much better. Then we got a bit of an EQ, still increasing a bit of the lower part of the low end. Not this, kind of doing this part, also doing a bit of fletchering because this part was a bit doofy. And then getting some highs and then doing, I think for this one, now normally for these kicks, I would like to do aggressive. But for this kick in particular, I didn't really like the way it sounded. Also, funny thing, I forgot to turn off true peak limiting on this kick. And normally I want that off because that actually kills your transients. I just completely forgot to because for some odd reason on the default, FabFilter Pro L. This is on. It really shouldn't be. It's awful, and it ruins your transients. Do not, if you are making heavy music, like heavy bass music, do not use true peak limiting. It destroys your transients, especially for mastering. Luckily, what I'm doing to the kick later, this isn't as big of an issue, but definitely a mistake that I did not catch, because that's the other thing about producing that I also want to talk about. When it comes to finishing songs, no song is going to be perfect. There are going to be mistakes in the song that you just did not catch, and that's just kind of how it is, and you've just got to roll with it. So yeah, like this, for instance, is just straight up something that I would not do, and I just forgot to turn it off. And then same for the snare as well. Unfortunately, the snare is multi-transient as well. Kind of making that, taking just a little bit of the attack off on the fundamental because it was a little bit doofy and a little bit strong, and then kind of turning up the attack on the high end and mid range, and then bringing up the attack overall and the sustain down on all of them. Some distortion, EQ, and then this one I'm doing aggressive because normally for kicks and snares I like aggressive. I usually only do the transparent mode that we saw before at the direct end of my drums bus chain right here, because aggressive would make it a bit too pumpy, and I don't really like that. And then we have a clap sample to be layered, Valhalla Room, distortion, EQ, and then a bit of a limiting, and then same thing for this one. They're very loud by themselves because of the mastering. And then I'm putting these into a clipper. This is what saves the true peak limiting. So the main reason I use a clipper here rather than a like a limiter is because a limiter doesn't do the same thing this clipper is doing, because this is keeping all the drum levels even. I'm going to turn this off. Do you hear how much louder the kick drum is over the snare and how distorted the kick drum is now versus... This basically keeps my drums even. Now, what I first would do is I would do this when I have a kick and a snare playing at the same time, because that also levels them out and gives it a nice sound without having to do that weird, yes, put the clap a little bit further away from the kick drum. That's stupid. Don't do that. Unless you're trying to go for like maybe a bit of like a multiple people clapping effect, then that can be cool. But I generally don't like that. At least for me, that's more of a taste thing. Also, it really messes with DJ software if you do the claps early. So this is basically just flattening out my drums, making them and giving me more headroom, which is really nice for what I'm doing next, which is an overall bus chain of distortion, which is just some saturation. The way I found out about this tip was super funny. Like Instagram just recommended me this random post that was like, put saturation on your drum bus. It sounds really cool. And I was like, I'm going to try that. And then I was like, wow, this does sound really cool. I'm glad I tried that. And I've been doing it ever since. It's basically just on a low mix because full sounds really stupid. So kind of get a bit more tone out of the drums. And then just a transparent one. Forgot to turn off true peak limiting. Again, a blunder. This is without true peak limiting. Drums would have been slightly more powerful. It definitely has its different sound, and I definitely, in retrospect, wish I turned this off. But yeah, definitely try and be aware, especially if you're using Pro L2. Because for some odd reason, this is the default, and I don't know why. It's very stupid, and it ruins your drums. So yeah, and then we got some hi-hats here. Just some reverb, compression, a bit of EQ, kind of tame this little harsh spot right here, and then bring up a bit of this, because without this, Feels very tinny and I don't really like it. Kind of brings out the body of the hi-hat. And then a limiter, because it was a little bit much. You can see for like a split second it goes over. And then hi-hat 2. Completely different sound, so it's not as often. Has a bit more of an accent flavor, bringing out the body and taming this part more and bringing out the very, very top end air. Also limiting it. Then we've got an open hat, which is going to sound very harsh because of the mastering. But yeah, some reverb, compression, EQ, just kind of flattening it out. And then I've got a ride loop. Normally I would just put a normal ride, but I wanted something a bit more active. And this seemed pretty cool. The sound, gave it a bit of reverb, some compression. Gives it a nice bit of flavor. And a layer on, and it gives it, kind of makes it sound like there's another open hat in there. So it kind of has like multiple flavors and feels like maybe a drummer's hitting the open hat slightly differently to give it that different pitch. And then just some, this I just kind of give to give that real drum flair. It just kind of adds a bit of air to it because this is my drums with it. Then I'm going to remove it. You feel how much more dry and like too close the drums feel. Now, I utilize this effect intentionally. Because in the scheme of the drop, the drums being this close and dry isn't as bad. Like it's actually fine. I do this effect so that way I actually like kind of learned this from something No Hope did, because normally I would just let this ride the whole time. But No Hope in our collab Abyss cut it to the very end, and it gave this feel of like, oh, the song's starting to open up and get ready to break down. And that's kind of the feel it gives of like, oh, the song's opening up a bit more. Like, that's just kind of how drops usually work. Like, it starts off with like the bass idea. Introduce a new thing. In this case, the hi-hats. The rides. And that last little effect to make it feel open. It's very subtle. It's a very subtle thing, but it helps a lot. But yeah, that's a way I do drum progression. I usually start the first 4 bars when it comes to mid-tempo, because most mid-tempo drops are 16 bars. Sometimes 24. In which case, if you are doing a 24-bar drop or even a 32-bar drop, you are going to need to take this concept and add more things to keep expanding every 4 bars. So maybe some percussion layers, something to vary it up, because you got to make this beat interesting. Because mid-tempo is a slower genre, so you have to make the drums feel interesting throughout. Yeah, that's how I do progression of drums. We're also going to talk about drum groove. So a lot of the groove in this song comes from the sidechain. This is the song without sidechain. Let me just solo the basses. Not very groovy. This is it with sidechain. The sidechain creates so much groove within those neurobasses that it's just super cool. Now that we've talked about like groove with sidechain, let's get into the actual basses themselves. I'm saving bass 1 for last because that's the one that I mentioned before. That's going to be kind of weird to talk about. Yeah, let's start off with this one. So, as a joke, I first called this res bass because I just find it very funny. Because everyone's like, oh, Big Crush bass sounds like res. I don't know. It's just a stupid joke that I put in the song. This is it without any of the post-processing. So basically what this is a basic shape sine wave FM'd by another basic shape sine wave with bend on it, bend minus, with an LFO acting as an envelope on the filter doing a low pass. And then we're doing hyperdimension, phaser, chorus, compressor, and we're doing downsampling. And then this gets put into my Midtempo plug bass rack, which is an OTT that I've adjusted. Normally it's my good OTT preset, which is like the depth at 50 and a couple other things tweaked. But I tweaked it a bit for this sound. Got some overdrive, ROM to add a bit of reverb, Saturn to distort these mids, adds a lot of character to the sound because without this, adds just like a little bit of warmth that just makes the sound pop. It's that last little 5% of the sound. And then parallel compression to add so much more power. This is without parallel compression. It seems very subtle. Do you see how the sound feels wider? Like it takes the scope of your headphones more and the sound just feels bigger. That's because it's parallel compression. It makes the reverbs feel bigger, like you're just making a stronger signal. And then we've got all this. It's very noticeable actually when I turn off the limiter. That's without, or that's with, and this is without. There we go. Limiter kind of flattens it out a bit. So I figured that might make it a bit more noticeable. Some EQ, keeping this low end in check because unlike other mid-tempo basses, this song was a bit heavy. I EQ'd a bit too much. I like to keep my EQs very separate, so that's why I EQ like this. Then one last EQ. And then a limiter to really tame in the sound because it was quite loud. So this was a happy accident. As you can see, this doesn't happen in other parts of the song. I was basically working on this part of the song and I duplicated this. Then I came back to work on this and I noticed that these two basses, which are pretty similar to each other, sound really cool stacked on top of each other. Luckily, it's not too dynamically different. Sounds pretty similar, but it basically just creates a nice texture and kind of phase canceling between them. Normally I don't do this. Normally I just kind of cut the top one out and don't really think about it. But this was just kind of a happy accident that happened. And it, as you can see, it stops throughout the rest of the song. It was just right here that it happened. So basically what this is, I'm just going to go over the top one because it's just slightly changed with the same processing. It's basically, this is just how you make a standard mid-tempo bass, like the big growl bass. Square wave FM'd by a random wavetable, can be literally any wavetable with an, and then I put a notch filter. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't, with a sub on a square, a noise, hyperdimension, phaser, chorus, all the same that we've been doing before. This time it's high pass a little bit higher to almost 500 hertz. Compressor, and then with diode to distortion. And I'm very low drive and kind of turning down the mix a bit. Then I put it into my growl bass rack, kind of the standard processing I do, slightly changed on that OTT. Distortion, ROM, iHeart, and then I actually put the Saturn after the parallel compression because it just sounds better on my growl basses. Kind of gets a bit more of that tone. Get a little bit of that high end, and a bit of that low end. Just add that character to the sound. Add a bit of low end here because it was a bit weak. And then ozone imager, actually making it a bit wider. And then I'm just taming that side end on the low end because I don't want that to be wider. kind of tame the frequency, adding a bit of side to the high end as well. You can see right here. Actually, I turned that off because I think it sounded bad. I think it made it too wide. So I turned that off. And then this is basically the same bass, except I think the wavetable is slightly different. Yeah, that's all it is. It's just different bend and FM values. It's nothing special. So this is a preset. Yes, I know, the Reese that I've been using forever is just a faceplant preset. However, I do think I make it slightly different enough. So that's at default, and I also usually will like mess with some things inside of it, like the vibrato, distortion. I'll usually do some like pitch sliding on it and also mess with phaser mix. So in this case, I chose it to be a bit faster. And then we got some OTT, slightly changed. Some distortion, bit of ROM. iHeart, saturation. Oh, this is all the same stuff because this is my Midtempo growl bass rack. You've got this, just some boosting the mids and taming the low end. And then more EQ. That was the same one. And then this was a special EQ I added to this because this was super loud and I had a previous EQ that was boosting it. And rather than changing it, I just figured I'd add another one. Just get some resonant spots out of the way or some really aggressive spots. But yeah, that's basically this part. And then in this part of the song, just another growl bass is added. It's the same preset, just slightly changed. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room. This thing, the main bass of the song. But before we talk about that, I'm going to talk about the layer on top of it because it's super interesting. So I'm going to actually create a new track here. This is a very weird thing that I accidentally discovered when I was resampling something in Harmor. So hey, my FL viewers, here's something for you to do, or people that were able to get Harmor into Ableton by having it for a very long time because they no longer support it. So us lucky people who had like old patches of it, myself included, are very happy. But yeah, so this is an interesting preset. So the concept is the same. This is going to be slightly different because of post-processing I did later in the patch, and I had to render it because it was doing some weird stuff. And it was just easier to render it out. Basically, the idea was I was trying to make a cool Neuro respace, and I was just kind of messing around, and I ended up getting this through some really weird stuff. So that's a little teaser, but this for some odd reason is modulated. I'm not quite sure. Kind of, if I want to tame any harmonics at all. Because sometimes I might want to do that. Harmonizer is just adding all those like cool frequencies you're hearing in there. This is the power of additive synthesis. We're doing unison on the Hertz mode. By the way, this is the same as this side, except for a little funny thing here. On the side signal, this is the default because it doesn't change it when you randomize it, which is super weird and is creating this like weird. It's what's creating all those weird tones and textures. Very cool sort of thing. I also changed this processing a bunch, put it in this part because that's what sounded cool. Nothing special in the effects. I changed some order on this. I believe I put harmonizer and phaser after the filters. I don't quite remember what the default is. But yeah, basically the special thing is also change the image format mutation on both of them. It's actually different on the side signal too, which is very weird. Also doing slight prism and having it go up. The harmonic prism is the same as usual. And then, yeah, so the phaser shape. So basically the idea is you have it on harmonic because it creates like those unique pauses where it's not the full spectrum. And that's kind of where you get your glitches from, like right there. And you basically would take that and really distort it to get that sound that you want. But yeah, you create just a weird phaser shape, mess with these a bit, change the width, offset. And then you kind of just mess with this. Get really cool sounds. But yeah, that's how I made that. I basically just put in key and then high passed it because there is some weird key harmonic stuff and I did not feel like putting it into Melodyne and fixing it individually. So I basically just high passed it to where there really isn't a pitch. And it just sounds very atonal, which is what I wanted. It's basically just meant to act as like high-end noise. This reverb, or not this reverb, this delay is meant to create like that sort of metallic effect that you hear at the end of the tail. Got some OTT and then comb filter to accentuate the metallic feel. Distortion, erosion, then we got driver, and some EQ. And just taming some really harsh resonances. This used to be a different frequency, and that's why this is here. But yeah, so this thing is super cool. I love it. As you can see, a lot of freezing happened. But yeah, so this is where things get hard to kind of describe. Unfortunately, with the process of creating neurobases, it is resampling over and over to the point where like, it depends on the basis. Sometimes it's fine on the first go, and sometimes it's not fine until the third or fourth go. Mostly because I'm still practicing it. I'm getting better at getting a good bass by the first or second try. But in this case, this one was like 3. This bass, unfortunately, I can't talk about how it was made. I can talk a bit about the post. I'm doing a bit of OTT, my default OTT patch, driver, parallel compression. And by the way, this is not the default OTT. This is a special preset that I made. And then I'm kind of changing the stereo a bit, making it a bit wider, doing a bit of EQ to tame in the low end. Make sure, even though it's a neurobass, it has like a big broad spectrum so you can hear it. I really don't feel like layering other stuff. Like this was supposed to just add some like cool high-end stuff like texture. This is more ear candy than it is like, oh, pay attention to this sound. Like it just makes it sound more interesting because without, it adds that like high-end grit. But yeah, little cool layering thing there. Then just making sure the stereo at the end is good. Which it is. Which makes sense because I try to keep that like pretty in phase. But yeah, basically the idea is I'm creating like a 16 bar sound design session. As you can see here, like it's a small part of a very big sound design session. And I'm basically chopping, and just like if I were to copy this over to here, I basically just put it here. I'm like, okay, that sounds like that's a cool spot for it. And then I just go through until I find something I like. And I'm like, oh, I like this part. And then I go with it. That's kind of how I decide to chop it. And then I'll also chop things together, which the sidechain makes work. That is a really hard movement for me to have gotten with just MIDI. It's so much easier to do with just bouncing it and then stabbing it together. Like I'm not super big on like, unless you're doing like modular patches where you're changing stuff and like, oh, I'm never going to get the sound again. I'm not a huge fan of like hour to 2 hour sound design sessions in like digital software synths because I just don't think it's necessary. I feel like you're just wasting hard drive space. I realize this is a very hot take. In my opinion, you can just create like a 16 bar thing and that's fine. But maybe the big long sound design session works better for you. I don't know. Whatever works for you to create. This is an opinion thing and this is what works for me. I prefer to just create the 16 bar thing and I can get a whole song out of it and be fine. And it also like keeps rhythmic consistency and stuff and blah, 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 blah. I could go on this tangent for ages. That's basically all the bases. You got that reverse sound here. Then we got the sub. Big boy. We've got here is the sub bass. Big boy. Very meaty, very loud. This is just for some added harmonics. And then the band passes on that to just kind of keep the harmonics there. Like, this is kind of the main meat of it and adding a bit of harmonics here as well. And it's also got a slight little pitch thing here to just add a bit of oomph to the bass. This adds like, it feels like there's a bit more of a hit. Don't really feel that in headphones. This is more of a club thing. This just makes sub basses hit harder in clubs. And then I'm adding this here to bring out a bit of the high-end grit from the sub bass, because there is a little bit because of mainly the square wave. And then I'm just saturating it. And then I am doing this weird EQ curve, which if you've never heard of this concept, probably looks super weird and you're wondering what I'm doing. So you might have had before where you're like pitching up your sub, like if you're doing like an 808 or something, like 808 slides, and you're like, wow, when it goes up, it's super loud. I got to volume automate that. This is basically doing that for you. I'm basically taking the lowest note, which is D, and EQing down the highest note, which is D2. And I usually put this in here just in case like I maybe do like a different part in the sub. But yeah, basically just get this nice little slope here. So that way, even though this is going down 8.1 dB, it sounds equal in volume. And this concept is called Fletcher-Munson, where if I hear a sine wave at 40 hertz, it's going to sound a lot quieter, even though it's at the same dB level as a sine wave at 2000 hertz. Because as the sound gets higher in pitch, the louder it seems to us. That's why we EQ a song with like a sub super high, and then it kind of goes like this and then sort of fades off on the high end, because that's what sounds good to the human ear. That's how the audio spectrum works. And you're just kind of applying that concept to subs to keep your subs balanced. Next up, we've got some glitches. This is just a glitch from me, from like glitch sample packs that I make. Yeah, just I put Serum Effects on this one for some reason. To get that down sample. I think there might be something I do with it later. No, I think I just want it to be down sampled. And then you get some distortion, EQ, limiter. It's fairly simple. I'm just putting a glitch sample in and then going crazy with it. And then another glitch sample from me. Same processing, I believe. It is. Yeah, nothing super special here. And then in the second drop, I'm skipping over slightly because we're just covering the glitches here. This is where things get a little bit more special. Got some OTT. I'm using Kilohertz Big Crush this time because I want to do this, I believe. Oh, no, not for this sound. There might be like some sounds where I will automate Bit Crush, for example, to make it feel like it's like pitch sliding a bit and just add a bit of cool depth to the sample. But yeah, Bit Crushing it, distorting it, OTTing it again, doing a bit of EQ, and then Kilohertz limiter. Yeah, cool sound. That one was not a sample for me. I think that was a Glitch Machine sample. They have really cool free sample packs and free plugins. Highly recommend checking them out if you make like glitchy music. Then you got this sound. I believe it's the same exact processing. It is. So yeah, those are the glitches in the song. All right, let's talk about the break. Okay, when the choir's not breaking. So the piano starts out playing the melody, or the arp, whatever. I consider an arp a melody, at least in this case. And then all this slowly rises up. And this is pretty similar. We got the added piano, but we've got a lot more instrumentation here. Like, we got the full orchestra now. So, got some violins, also from the Native Instruments Symphony series, except it's the string ensemble this time. Some compression and EQ. We got violas. Now, something I should mention, something that I started doing, is I have started to pan the violins left and right. Well, the violins and the violas left and right, just to kind of add a bit more stereo feel, make them feel a bit wider, bring a bit more of that orchestral mic feel. Definitely something I recommend doing. Didn't do it in this song because I was still kind of starting to experiment with orchestral stuff, expanding my sound a bit, building my sound up. Because I think it's really good to evolve your sound over the course of the years, so that way you don't stagnate and feel kind of creatively. Kind of the introduction to this. I do EQ this viola differently. Yes, I do. Kind of keep this down and EQ the high end slightly less. Then we got the trumpets from before. Kind of at the same intensity. We already covered these guys. Trombones as well. Then a very interesting introduction. So originally I put French horns here. And for some odd reason, they just weren't working with the song. And I was like, I really don't like it. And I kind of forgot to change the name here. I probably should have called this trombone 2, if I want to be correct. These are technically just really high trombones. But they sound a bit like French horns. Not entirely. They do kind of sound like high trombones, but they do have that same feel. They are fulfilling the same purpose. They don't necessarily have the same tonality, but they're filling up the same spectrum, because the normal tonality of French horns just sounded weird and wrong. I don't know why, but it just sounded off to me. So I actually included trombones here instead, because it was just a fun little experiment that sounded cool. And then tuba. Very big, cinematic feel. Very evil sounding. Yeah, another introduction is another choir. And you can see this choir is a lot more textural. And that's Mysteria. Mysteria is the textural choir library. Very highly recommended for that. It creates great textures, great details. Adds a lot of like detail and texture to your choir because of all the different, like you can hear all those people doing those cool movements with their voices. Super cool library, highly recommend it. Also from Native Instruments. But yeah, there's only a couple more things to talk about actually. Next up, we've got very similar sound design. There's like some patch changes and stuff. This one I showed you earlier, and a couple bass changes here. Blah, 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 blah. Like stuff we've already seen. Nothing super special here. However, what I have done is I've switched around the bass samples a bit, like what's chopped up. I went through them individually, figured out what sounded good. Same for actually the textural sample on top, because this is also part of like a big sound design session. This one's a bit larger because I was kind of like experimenting and changing it as I went. But the big difference here, sort of similar to Error, is I did a beat change. And also in the build-up, I did this, or in the pre-drop, I did this instead. I did this instead. Very slight change. I just moved a beat off slightly. So that way it subtly will tell you like, oh, this is going to be different. Just slightly different stuff. But the tom fill into it is the same, which I also used again for right here. Forgot to mention this. Can I get out of here? Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about this fill. So this fill, which is also used over here, was like a very distorted tom that I just downsampled, and I'm automating the drive to make it feel like it's going up in pitch, or down in pitch in this case. Put driver and reverb on it. That's what's in here, by the way. It's nothing special. I'm not hiding anything special from you guys. It's literally just a downsampler. Some EQ here. Yeah, just to make a more interesting tom fill, kind of a bit more textural, kind of feel like a mixture of a glitch and a more like tom fill. And then I reuse it here just with a slightly different groove. Kind of go back to the other groove because we were going from this. Go back to the old groove. It kind of gives that transition like a bit of, because it's very similar in the sense that this basically what it's doing is these two are very drawn out. So that way for that little split second, it is giving your ear a bit of anticipation. And then this is kind of the like, okay, we're back into it. This shorter one. That's kind of the idea of it. But yeah, completely different groove on here. This is like a bit more of a halftime groove, like the genre halftime where it's like a hip hop groove in neuro. So now what I'm doing is I'm making the snare pattern more complicated, and then I'm switching to the more complicated kick pattern. Just a bit more of a complicated drum rhythm and pattern for the second drop. Then we've got another glitch sound here. Oh, that's the one we covered earlier. Slightly different big crush bass. It is. I think it's just slightly changed values, nothing super special. Yeah, I turned the bend up and it sounded cool. It's basically it. I probably changed down sampling slightly. Yeah, basically, normally I would do like a pretty big change for the second drop. That's usually something that's very noticeable. But this beat change was enough. I didn't have to change up the sound design too much. Like obviously I changed position to make it sound different, and hearing the bass act a bit differently was enough variety. I didn't need to go any crazier, which was cool. And actually made the song really a lot easier to write for the second drop. And finally, for outro, before we get into mastering and mixing as a concept, because I've shown what I've done in mixing, but I'm going to talk about it conceptually for a second. So, there's only a couple things here. This is here. This makes a return. And then at the end here, this kind of gets consumed by the portal. And that's that little like outro thing you hear when the thing's done after it resolves. And then we've got a piano holding chords. Oh, this is the art piano from before. Piano holding chords. Some nice reverb on it. some parallel compression, normal compression, EQ, and some stereo to just kind of keep it a bit more in phase. It kind of goes out of it at the end, but that's fairly normal. Then I kept some trombones here. Keep that evil feel up. Yeah. Oh yeah, one last thing I should talk about. Let's talk about theory. So, nothing too crazy-ish here with theory. This is technically in D Phrygian, but it's a little bit weird. I'm playing an inversion of a D minor chord here, but I wanted the same half step feel. So I'm having it go up a half step, but instead of having it be like this, for example, I have it do this, which is a weird feel to a chord. So I'm basically sharping my third, and then I'm also flatting my, I guess you could say I'm flatting my fourth and flatting my second, if you want to think about it that way, since I'm doing two flats here. But yeah, this is basically flatted whenever this chord goes up, because I wanted the same half step motion, but I also wanted to keep that Phrygian feel for this. So it kind of gives us like weird double Phrygian feel. But yeah, this is a very interesting chord, very weirdly spaced out. And then we've got an F major chord, and then D minor, same progression over and over. And then right here, it changes to a C minor before it resolves back to the D minor. But yeah, everything's kind of in a weird inversion, which kind of allotted for an interesting scale. Or like, it's technically in D minor, but it's kind of in this weird area. It's a very cool little theory thing. But yeah, Phrygian modes are cool. Definitely recommend exploring them if you like making evil music. And also, if you're wondering what this is just so I can press this and render without having to go like, yep, and then hit render. I can just press that and then hit render, and it'll render everything. All right. So mixing and mastering. So I know, my music is loud. Let's get past that, because the genre I make is loud. Like, hard drum and bass is always like -2 LUFS anyways. Midtempo is usually -3 LUFS unless you're res. So who cares? When it comes to mixing, my mastering is actually not what's pushing my songs so loud. My songs pre-master are like -4 or -5 LUFS. A lot of my loudness comes from my mixing. And that's kind of how I approach my mixing. And I also approach like keeping a pretty clean stereo field. I try to keep everything below like 250 to 300 hertz mono. I don't like stereo low end. I think it sounds awful. The only cases if you're doing film scoring, then you might want to keep it. But other than that, I think it sounds awful. I don't like it. It makes my head dizzy, and I hate it. One of my least favorite things. But yeah, I just try to approach like getting the song as possible as ready, so that way in the master, I only have to make minor tweaks. Because while you do see a lot of plugins, this is just to get rid of anything below 30 hertz, linear phase EQ, or in this case 20, because it's a D, and it kind of would mess with it if I put it up higher. So I did 20 hertz in this case. And then these are just metering plugins. So it's really just, I sometimes will also put soothe if the song is just a bit harsh. If you don't know what soothe is, in my opinion, this song is a fine level of like aggro on the highs. But if you don't know what soothe is, it basically finds stuff it thinks is harsh and will take it out of the mix. In this case, I didn't think it was necessary, but on a lot of my mixes, I use soothe, and it makes things sound so much better. I highly recommend soothe. They usually go on sale around Easter time. I don't know why. That's when they usually go on sale, or at least when I've seen them go on sale. So try to look out for that if you're looking to get it. They do have like a free 30-day trial. I'm going to warn you, it's going to make you want to spend money on it. because the plugin's that good. It is just a mix fixer. It does the whole spectrum and can just make things sound so much better. But yeah, this is another free plugin called Choral from Acoustic Audio, same people that made the titanium bass preset, or titanium bass plugin, not preset. Basically, this is just a high-end EQ. It can also do low-end, but I'm choosing to do just high-end. This is a mid-side EQ from Ozone. Keep the side in check and keep the mid in check. Also lets me check how it sounds on each one. And in my opinion, it sounds pretty good. Now you're noticing this Ozone 8 maximizer is gone. I used to use Ozone 8 so much, just Ozone in general. Now I only use their EQ. I have found over the years that I don't like this anymore. As you can see, I had mastering well equipped here. I had True Peak off. I have switched to Pro L entirely. I love Pro L. It doesn't create like any like clipping artifacts in my buildups. I can keep it on the aggressive mode, make it super loud as I want it without creating like super harsh buildup artifacts. Because like when you filter something, for example, there's like, even if you don't have resonance on, it's like slightly resonating the sound, so it's making it louder. And Ozone will create these like high-end artifacts of like clipping that just don't sound good. And so I have switched to Pro L. I am a Pro L believer now, and I love it. But yeah, raising it by about 4 dB. I want to keep a little bit of look ahead. I like to keep it on the aggressive mode for my super aggro stuff. I might switch to like a modern, punchy mode all around, or maybe transparent if I'm doing something a bit softer. Might also still do aggressive because it's me. Make sure this channeling transients is all the way up. That's very important. I keep a low attack and release because that's just how I want it. I don't really like having long attacks and releases on my mastering chain because I want it to squish the song as much as possible, at least for the drop. And that's the other reason why I really like Pro L. Pro L has allowed me to have the loudness that I had with Ozone, but also keep my dynamic intros, which I've been really loving. It's made my songs so much more dynamic, which I have been a big fan of. And then just span. This is just a preset. Fun fact, if you want your span slope to match Pro Q3's 0 dB slope, which if you don't know about that, if you want your song to display properly, weird thing they put in EQs is, I believe, it's this. See this tilt thing? By default, it's this. Now this is supposed to be what your human ear is hearing, but it's not accurate to what the sound is in value. So you want to turn off tilt to 0 dB per octave. And for some odd reason, in span, or to get it to look similar, it's 2.3. I don't know why. It's a free plugin. I'm not going to judge it that harshly. But yeah, if you want your span to sort of feel the same as your Pro Q, that's how I like the red color, because why not? Yeah, super low RMS, and then this is another free, this is what I usually recommend for metering. And try to keep this true peak max under about 0.8. Another way you can limit how much it's doing that, I'm actually already doing it, is by oversampling. It's very good for limiting these true peak max values without having to do true peak limiting. But it's also an aggro song, so it doesn't really matter. And then this is just to check stereo. So, ideal thing with Midtempo is you want the stereo to be interesting. That's like a main appeal of the genre. So as you can see, the pluck bass is like pretty center. It's got a bit of width to it. And then when those big neuro basses come in, like it's playing with like super wide and then super closed in, which is pretty fun to do. It's a pretty big appeal of mid-tempo. Just making sure like that my stereo feel is good. And that I've sort of got this perfect diamond. Like I've got stuff way out here. Got stuff way out here, which is really good for that perfect diamond feel. But my song still sounds good in mono. Like if I solo this. But yeah, that's basically going to do it. That's how I do my mastering. That's how I make a mid-tempo track, even a super unique one like this one. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is my second time recording it because the first time I recorded in the wrong quality. Professional YouTuber. But yeah, I hope you guys really like this. I hope this brings you some value. I want you to think of this as a homework assignment to go make some mid-tempo. Be sure to follow me if you enjoy this. Be sure to subscribe. And go listen to Riot. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.